Va bene, benvenuti tutti. Io inizio in italiano adesso con un avviso tecnico pure pratico per la traduzione. Dovete scansionare questo codice QR che vedete qua e poi scegliete la vostra lingua. Si chiede anche di inserire un'email, ma può essere un'email finto, quindi un indirizzo finto. So also for the English speaking, for the translation you have to scan this QR code on your screen and then select your preferred language. It will be in subtitles only. Also for the English speaking, if you need subtitles. Father Anthony studied in Germany, in Austria, in a part where, so to say, you need subtitles to understand the natives. It's in Steiermark, where Arnold Schwarzenegger is from. So, but get more serious now. So dear Father Anthony, dear colleagues, professors, dear students, also dear guests, also those who are following us via live stream, you told me that also in St. John's it will be broadcasted or watched. So greetings from Rome. It's a particular pleasure to welcome Father Anthony Ruff here to Rome and to Sant'Anselmo. There is something fitting about hosting this conversation now in this city. Rome is, after all, the place where the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy was promulgated, where then the post-conciliar reform took shape and where its reception continues to unfold. And I think also Sant'Anselmo has a particular place in this process of the liturgical renewal. Father Anthony Ruff is a monk and a priest of St. John's Abbey in Collegeville, Minnesota. A lot of students know Liturgical Press, I hope, from their research and their studies. Collegeville is a community that is a distinguished place in the history of the liturgical movement, the American liturgical or North American liturgical movement, and therefore has long maintained close ties with the Benedictine world here at Sant'Anselmo. Father Anthony teaches liturgy, liturgical music, Gregorian chant at St. John's Theological School of Theology and Seminary, sorry for those at Collegeville. He's widely known as a scholar, lecturer, public voice in liturgical studies. He was part of the ISIL, so the Commission for the translation, for the English translation of the Missal, and therefore he has also some experience on the practice, or the practical side of the liturgical reform. Today he invites us to look beyond the debates that have often set Benedict XVI and Francis against one another, and to ask, but is from our perspective now a genuine synthesis, or how it might look like. So we're happy to have you here, and we're also happy to have our rector here, Father Jaakko Fejavari. He's joining us for this lecture today because today he's very busy. Therefore, we are very grateful that you are here. So, Father Anthony, a warm welcome, and now the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Pater Stefan. St. Paul criticized the community at Corinth because some of them were saying, I belong to Paul, or I belong to Apollos, or I belong to Cephas, or I belong to Christ. Some of you will remember that Pope Francis cited this very scripture passage when he issued Traditionis Custodes, restricting the use of the pre-Vatican II liturgy. I have the impression that on matters liturgical, there are some in the Roman Catholic Church who speak about their allegiance either to Pope Benedict or to Pope Francis. I belong to Pope Benedict and support Summorum Pontificum, or I belong to Pope Francis and support Traditionis Custodes. In this talk, I will attempt to make my modest contribution to church unity by breaking down some stereotypes of each pope. The differences between Pope Benedict and Pope Francis in matters liturgical are well known. Less known, I think, is the common ground that they shared. I believe that each of them has contributed to the Church's ongoing reception of the Second Vatican Council, and I will suggest that the Church would benefit by receiving the liturgical legacy of both popes appreciatively, but also in some respects with a certain amount of prudence and creative reinterpretation. It is important to note that for the vast majority of Roman Catholics, the liturgical reforms of the Second Vatican Council are accepted unproblematically. By and large, the Roman Catholic Church is at peace liturgically. But that doesn't mean that liturgical controversies should be dismissed or ignored. In the body of Christ, if one member suffers, all suffer together with it. And we should all bear this suffering together and work to heal it, because some members of the Roman Catholic Church are suffering when it comes to liturgy. I will argue that the entire Church can benefit from the liturgical controversies by coming to a deeper understanding of the meaning of the Second Vatican Council. That work is by far not completed. I turn first to the liturgical thought of Pope Benedict, Joseph Ratzinger. In 2011, the Pontificio Istituto Liturgico here at Sant'Anselmo celebrated the 50th anniversary of its founding by Pope John XXIII. Pope Benedict gave an address here. In it, he spoke positively of the liturgical reform, albeit while recognizing flaws. He said, quote, "We must note the abundant fruits generated by the Holy Spirit in half a century of history, and let us thank the giver of all good for this, despite the misunderstandings and errors in the practical implementation of the reform," close quote. I highlight this positive appraisal because sometimes the impression is given that Joseph Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict, spoke only critically of the reform. At various times, it is true, he has described the post-conciliar liturgy, and I'm using English translation here, with terms such as banality, superficiality, deficiencies, fragmentation, impoverishment, wretchedness, deformation, disintegration, destruction, devastation, anarchy, and chaos. But in an important article from 2013, William Johnston convincingly argued that Pope Benedict's fundamental assessment of the liturgical reform was actually positive. Johnston maintains that the Pope's more critical comments were focused, and he wrote, quote, "limited in scope, and they need to be balanced by and interpreted in the context of his words of affirmation for the liturgical reform." Let us consider some of those words of affirmation. First, concerning the liturgy before Vatican II, Cardinal Ratzinger understood the need for reform. In 2001, Ratzinger named the problems to be overcome in the preconciliar liturgy and its attendant theology. He stated, quote, "For a certain kind of textbook theology, what matters in the sacraments and likewise in the Eucharist was essentially their validity, and therefore the moment of consecration. It was thus necessary to discover anew that the liturgy is not just a collection of ceremonies that aim to give length and solemnity to the consecration, but that this is the world of the sacraments as such. Thus, to rediscover that the liturgy in itself is living and is a reality experienced by the Church as such was a development that considerably enriched the Church." His assessment that the ceremonies of the liturgy, or what we might now call the sacramental ritual actions, are a living reality, and they are the world of the sacraments as such, is significant. I will return to this point later. Johnston notes that Pope Benedict wrote of the post-Vatican II Missal, quote, "There is no doubt that the new Missal in many respects brought with it a real improvement and enrichment," close quote. Benedict affirmed the new experience of fellowship and of community participation in the Eucharistic mystery. In his 2025 apostolic exhortation, Sacramentum Caritatis, Pope Benedict wrote that, quote, "The difficulties and even the occasional abuses cannot overshadow the benefits and the validity of the liturgical renewal, whose riches are yet to be fully explored." I emphasize that Benedict thought that there are riches yet to be explored in the Reformed liturgy, and I hope to explore some of those riches. We see then that Pope Benedict affirmed liturgical reform, but as he himself said, someone who does not think that everything in the liturgy turned out well and considers many things subject to reform or even in need of revision is not, therefore, an opponent of the council. William Johnston can teach us that when we come across a statement in which Ratzinger, Benedict, criticizes the post-conciliar liturgy, we should place that statement within the context of his affirmation of liturgical reform. Benedict was not rejecting the reform nor calling for a return to the preconciliar liturgy. Rather, he was talking about how the Reformed liturgy could be better understood and celebrated. But what about Summorum Pontificum? With this 2007 document, Pope Benedict gave full freedom to celebrate Mass using the 1962 Missal, no longer needing special permission. Did this document call into question the liturgical reform? I would suggest that in interpreting Summorum Pontificum, we should contend with two distinct streams of thought within the mind of Benedict. The first stream emphasizes the innate value of the preconciliar liturgy. The second stream emphasizes its usefulness for renewing the post-conciliar liturgy. The first stream affirms the preconciliar liturgy as something good in itself. In his letter to the bishops accompanying Summorum Pontificum, Benedict expressed what I call the first stream when he wrote, "What earlier generations held as sacred remains sacred and great for us too, and it cannot be all of a sudden entirely forbidden or even considered harmful. It behooves all of us to preserve the riches which have developed in the Church's faith and prayer, and to give them their proper place." But there is a second stream in Benedict's thought which provides another, and I think more useful way to interpret and appropriate the wisdom of Summorum Pontificum. Here, the existence of the old liturgy is meant to improve our celebration of the Reformed liturgy. Benedict wrote of mutual enrichment, which is to say, he wanted the preconciliar rite to enrich the new rite. Benedict wrote in his letter accompanying Summorum Pontificum that, with greater use of the old rite, quote, "The celebration of the Mass according to the Missal of Paul VI will be able to demonstrate more powerfully than has been the case hitherto the sacrality which attracts many people to the former usage. This will bring out the spiritual richness and the theological depth of this Reformed Missal. Note that when Benedict issued Summorum Pontificum, he spoke of bringing out the spiritual richness and theological depth of the 1970 Missal. When Benedict wrote in the same letter that in the history of the liturgy there is growth and progress, but no rupture, he was calling for a greater understanding that the Reformed liturgy should be seen not as a new creation, but as part of the tradition of the Church. I will return later to the traditional nature of the Reformed liturgy. Now, I have to say, the main problem, perhaps, with Summorum Pontificum's coexistence of two Roman rites, one old and one new, is that it is difficult for me to reconcile with the statements of Sacrosanctum Concilium. The Liturgy Constitution envisioned that a forthcoming Reformed rite would entirely replace the existing rite. It makes no provision for the continuance of the old rite. Sacrosanctum Concilium, Article 4, is not referring to the existing 1962 rite when it acknowledges all rites to be equally valid, but it is referring to the Roman rite alongside the many Eastern Catholic rites. When Sacrosanctum Concilium says, for example, that the order of Mass must provide a part for the people, there is no asterisk next to that statement, with an exception made for those who prefer to celebrate with the 1962 Missal, which never once mentions the people in the entire order of Mass. Sacrosanctum Concilium gives, by my count, approximately 100 ways that the old rite needed to be changed. Some of the changes are small. Many of the changes are comprehensive and far-reaching. The list of changes in Sacrosanctum Concilium is quite large. I don't think it envisioned just a minor refining of the existing rite. It gives me no pleasure to say this, but I feel that I must. The Second Vatican Council did not say anything like, what earlier generations held as sacred remains sacred and great for us too. Rather, in effect, it said, with all due respect and reverence for the old rite, it needs to be reformed in order to be used in the Catholic Church. But I understand why Pope Benedict saw the post-conciliar situation so seriously that he felt it did justify readmitting the old rite, and I really want to respect what he was trying to do. I turn to the seriousness of the liturgy. As I try to receive as generously as possible the deep concerns Pope Benedict raised about the Reformed liturgy in Summorum and elsewhere, I find it helpful to view his critique as a salutary reminder of the seriousness of the liturgy and a call for an examination of conscience where this seriousness has not been maintained. Behind Pope Benedict's very strong criticism of the Reformed liturgy is a concern that it had sometimes become unserious. Sometimes the impression has been given that the liturgy is not that important anymore. It is now casual, informal, and rather pedestrian. Or, because of its wordy boredom, one needs to add a bit of entertainment value to it. We've all experienced this. No doubt the intentions behind these missteps were good, and I do not criticize the good faith efforts of others. But those of us committed to the liturgical reform would do well to be less defensive and to admit that something has gone wrong when the liturgy does not come across with sufficient depth, weightiness, and beauty. And this isn't about judgment or about condemnation. It's about saying, you know, what is God's grace saying to us now as we move forward gracefully? Father John Baldwin addressed this issue already in 2002, and he did so by drawing on Josef Ratzinger, among others. Though Baldwin does not agree with the entirety of Ratzinger's appraisals, yet he writes, quote, "I cannot gainsay or deny the accuracy of his criticism that so much contemporary liturgy has become trivialized by the efforts of many who think that their task is to make it up." Baldwin criticizes the practice in which the introductory rites have things like talking about the weather, autobiographical introductions, humor, and generally warming people up for worship. Such things, he says, divert the assembly from the serious business of entering into an experience of the world's and our life and death. Baldwin approvingly quotes Ratzinger, who wrote that the liturgy is God's descent upon our world. He wrote, quote, "The liturgy becomes personal, true, and new, not through tomfoolery and banal experiments with words, but," this is Ratzinger, not Baldwin, "but through a courageous entry into the great reality that, through the rite, is always ahead of us." He emphasizes God's prior action, God's descent upon our world, and I believe Ratzinger is absolutely right. That we'll return to that point later. I turn now to the liturgical legacy of Pope Francis. In 2022, Pope Francis gave an address here at the Pontificio Instituto Liturgico in which he strongly opposed critics of the liturgical reform. He said, "Every reform creates resistance. Closed mindsets use liturgical matters to defend their own point of view, using the liturgy. This is the drama we are experiencing in church groups that are distancing themselves from the church, questioning the council, the authority of the bishops, in order to preserve tradition." In 2017, Pope Francis told participants in Italy's National Liturgical Week, quote, "After this magisterium of the Second Vatican Council, after this long journey, we can affirm with certain and magisterial authority that the liturgical reform is irreversible." There is no denying that statements such as these have a different tenor than those of Pope Benedict. Pope Francis certainly viewed the state of post-conciliar liturgy more positively than Benedict and differed in his vision for the way forward. But I would make 2 points. First, Pope Francis's manner of celebrating the liturgy, even if his vestments were a bit drab and inelegant, was reverent and serious, very much like the style of Pope Benedict. Regarding the seriousness of the liturgy, Pope Francis's writings are very much consonant with the mindset of Pope Benedict. I would point especially to Francis's apostolic letter of 2022, Desiderio Desideravi, on the liturgical formation of the people of God. This is one of the most beautiful documents we have on the spirit of the Reformed liturgy. The focus of this document is that we recover a sense of wonder at the beauty of the liturgy. So much of Desiderio Desideravi could have been written by Benedict, especially its call for contemplation of the beauty and truth of Christian celebration, and statements such as these. The action of the celebration does not belong to the individual, but to the Christ Church, to the totality of the faithful united in Christ. We should marvel at the fact that the salvific plan of God has been revealed. The true artist does not possess an art, but rather is possessed by it. Such statements call to mind Ratzinger's emphasis on God's descent in the liturgy. It saddens me that as a symptom of the liturgical divisions of our time, friends and colleagues of mine who are sympathetic to Benedict liturgically are not able to see the spirit of Benedict in Desiderio Desideravi, but are skeptical of the document simply because it comes from Pope Francis. This mirrors people on the other side who, in their sympathy for Pope Francis, are not able to hear and believe how strongly Benedict affirmed the Reformed liturgy, nor can they hear the truth in Benedict's critique of post-conciliar liturgical problems. But in fact, and this is my second point, Francis made his own the statements of Benedict that criticized liturgical abuses. In his letter accompanying Traditiones Custodes, Francis wrote, "At the same time, I am saddened by abuses in the celebration of the liturgy on all sides. In common with Benedict XVI, I deplore the fact that in many places the prescriptions of the new missal are not observed in celebration, but indeed come to be interpreted as an authorization for or even a requirement of creativity, which leads to almost unbearable distortions," close quote. So this is Francis, but he agrees with Benedict. But in advancing his liturgical views, Pope Francis at times used unfortunately sharp language. For example, he criticized a very strong reactionary attitude, what he called indietrismo, being backward-looking, which he said is useless. He repeatedly accused those who prefer the old Mass of being rigid and defensive, whereas true love is not defensive. And then there is the time that he referred to younger priests who are more conservative as little monsters. I fear that such language pushed some Catholics away from being able to hear the good in Francis's liturgical vision. The way forward, my attempt at a synthesis. I now attempt to sketch out a synthesis of the thought of these two remarkable popes. I strive to do so in the spirit of what St. Paul wrote to the Galatians on the fruits of the Spirit. May it be our aim in all liturgical deliberations to exhibit the fruits of the Spirit. And I apply that first of all to myself. I am grateful for Pope Francis's zeal for liturgical reform based upon the Second Vatican Council, which I would separate from his sometimes divisive and antagonizing language. The groundbreaking ethnographical research of Nathaniel Marks on the attitude of those drawn to the Latin Mass is helpful for avoiding stereotypes of Latin Mass Catholics, who vary widely in their openness to perhaps even a possible reorientation toward the Reformed liturgy. Dr. Marks wrote a doctoral dissertation, and it did involve a lot of field research. And after reading that dissertation, I realized it is simply not true to say that all of the Latin Mass people are rigid and defensive. Perhaps some are, but not all. I am grateful for Pope Benedict's zeal for a reformed liturgy which must become more serious and more beautiful, and for his alerting us to the deficiencies in our current liturgical practice, which, again, I would separate from some of his sharply negative comments. I think William Johnston, whom I cited earlier, is onto something when he suggests that Ratzinger's overly strong words arose from what he said, his personal feeling that he was being, quote, opposed or even dismissed by the community of liturgical theologians and practitioners. This pained Ratzinger. Johnson asks, when you feel you are not being heard, when your critique goes nowhere, what do? Sometimes you may exaggerate for effect. As Flannery O'Connor, an author from the southern United States, wrote, to the hard of hearing you shout, and for the almost blind you draw larger and startling figures. Perhaps Ratzinger was doing that. If so, that helps us receive his seemingly negative comments, which can seem off-putting at first. I propose 4 points as I sketch out a synthesis of the thought of Francis and Benedict. First, Pope Francis has clarified that the liturgical reform of Vatican II is irreversible, and the Reformed liturgy is now the basis for liturgical renewal. To improve our celebration of the Reformed liturgy, as both Benedict and Francis desired, we will no longer aim at a long-term combining of the old rite and the new rite into a third new thing. Rather, we will focus on discovering the riches of the new rite. Anything that we might borrow or retrieve from the old rite will be incorporated into the new rite only to the extent that it is compatible with the nature of the new rite. And I fear that Benedict's mutual enrichment did not make that point clear. It contained a kernel of truth, but mutual enrichment ended up being too relativistic, as if the two rites are equal and will split the difference. I don't know if that's what he intended. But it did not make sufficiently clear that the new rite is normative in the process of the two rites interacting with each other. I mean, my monastery in Minnesota, we're in the process of reforming our divine office quite substantially. And it's interesting that we're retrieving an opening invitatory, which they eliminated after Vatican II. We are adding in daily Compline, which they eliminated. We'll be singing the Marian antiphon every night in Latin. We're now going to sing all of the Psalms at Vespers. Our abbot consulted with the community and decided he would wear the mitre like all the other abbots do. We, added adoration once a week, all fall, to Vespers or to Compline. But in all of this, there's really no one hankering for the old liturgy. There's no one upset about what we're doing. But I experience that we are at peace and we are saying, how can we do what's right for our time? No one is judging what went before. We know the people who did all of the work since Vatican II. It's 100% appreciative, but there can be a peaceful way of, if you will, improving what we have now based on the current rite and its needs, and not based on trying to recover something that was supposedly better before. Second, we must understand that in the mind of the Church, the Reformed rite is more traditional, not less traditional than what preceded it. This point was strongly and repeatedly emphasized in the magisterium of Pope St. Paul VI. The liturgical reform did not simply espouse a return to the golden age of the liturgy, say in the 6th century. Rather, it was a reception of the entire 2,000-year tradition of the Church, with the various elements of 2 millennia reconfigured and rebalanced, drawing on every century. With all due respect for the 1962 rite, and certainly for those who celebrate it, this rite is not more traditional. Rather, it is one isolated stage in the Church's ongoing journey toward greater truth. In Summorum Pontificum, Benedict, in fact, sought to place the new rite more deeply within the liturgical tradition of the Church so that it would be seen as such. For all these reasons, I think it is urgent that we ban the misleading term traditional Latin Mass. For Catholics, the Mass of Vatican II is the traditional Mass. I don't mean that polemically, but I do mean it. And here I will state for the record, though I do not have time to develop the point here, that in my understanding, the Catholic understanding of real presence and of the Mass as sacrifice is stronger and more traditional in the Missal of Paul VI than it was in the preconciliar Missal. Third, Pope Benedict's rightful emphasis on God's descent in the liturgy and on the living reality of the liturgy should be brought together with the notion of active participation in Sacrosanctum Concilium number 48. Andrea Grillo, who teaches here at Sant'Anselmo, has helpfully taught me the full implications of Article 48. Grillo notes that it does not simply say, as in an earlier draft, that the faithful should understand well the rites and prayers. That is something you were to do at the old rite by paying careful attention to the action of the priest. Rather, the final approved version of Sacrosanctum Concilium 48 says that the faithful understand the mystery of faith through their own rite and prayer. Per ritus et preces. This per is highly significant. In Sacrosanctum Concilium, prayers and rites are not objects to be perceived better by the faithful through their active participation. Rather, prayers and rites are the means through which the faithful grasp the mystery of faith. This is, to pull it together, the world of the liturgy referred to by Joseph Ratzinger. Grillo notes the significance of this article of the Liturgy Constitution when he writes, "If it were simply a question of understanding and being pious, new rites and old rites would be substantially equivalent. If, on the other hand, the common action of Christ and the Church is at stake, then the decision to reform the order, the liturgical order, is justified and supported by nothing other than the acquired evidence of this need for participation in common action." I agree with Grillo that this is the key to the liturgical reform, and I would submit that this has not yet been fully realized, despite all of our good faith efforts. The Catholic faithful, I include myself in this, have not yet fully grasped that their common words and actions are not just empty rituals, but are the means by which God descends, the means by which Christ acts through them. And so, to name one example, the exchange of peace in the Mass is not irreverent in my view because it gets too exuberant or lasts too long, as if we want to avoid an excess of Christian love for one another. That's not the problem. The exchange of peace is irreverent because it becomes just a pedestrian secular greeting without an awareness that per ritus et praeces, through our liturgical action, we are actively bestowing Christ's peace on one another, and that we are thereby changed. In this, the useless distinction is overcome between whether the liturgy is theocentric or anthropocentric, whether it's God-centered or man-centered. It is both. The more human-centered the liturgy is, rightly understood, the more it is centered upon God and what he is doing in his church. The more God is found in the communal action, it is urgent at a time of declining mass attendance in many places that the entire church comes to this understanding of the liturgy. For this is the way that the Reformed liturgy can become a meaningful and life-changing encounter with God, rather than a bunch of meaningless rote rituals. Fourth, we would benefit from greater clarity on what it means for Catholics to accept the Second Vatican Council. It is sometimes claimed that those Catholics who attend the so-called traditional Latin Mass accept the Second Vatican Council. I would, in part, challenge that statement. We need to find a way to make a distinction between partial and full acceptance, not with a view toward judgment, but with a view toward building one another up and coming toward a greater as yet envisioned unity. I respect my fellow Catholics who attend the old rite, and I can even sense, I think, what draws them. There's a strong sense of community when you are in a church with an exotic ritual and with a large community, lots of young people who are really committed to it. So I certainly respect and strive to understand. I sense that perhaps some people are drawn to the old rite in part because of the many problems named by Pope Benedict in how the new rite is celebrated. I regret that they have not yet experienced the great benefit of drawing close to God through liturgical participation according to Sacrosanctum Concilium 48. To acknowledge merely that the Reformed rite is valid and licit while preferring the old rite is an acceptance of Vatican II, but it's a rather minimal acceptance. A more full acceptance, a true sentire cum ecclesia, would be found in accepting the need for the liturgical reform and embracing the Reformed liturgy by choosing to celebrate it rather than the old rite. But any kind of movement in that direction, I expect, would take a long time, and I don't have any solutions for how to get there in the short term or even in the long term. I'm just naming what I understand to be the goal and the teachings of the Catholic Church. I conclude by stating again my appreciation for the contributions of both Benedict and Francis to liturgical reform. The way forward is very much unknown, no doubt filled with challenges that will stretch all of us. But it is the work of the entire Church. As we deepen our encounter with Christ through our communal participation in the prayers and rites of the liturgy, may God bless us richly.